about ego and fame. Her previous books, Ain't I a Woman and Black Looks, provide new scholarship, mixing academic writing with personal testimony. Killing Rage, Ending Racism is her latest book, and I'm pleased to have her back here. Welcome back.
It's good to be back.
Last time you were here, we were having a conversation, and I had a bunch of letters, this is true, saying, why did you allow those men, these were African-American men in this case, to beat up on Belle? And I said, Bell Hooks can take care of herself. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I mean, I thought I took care of myself that evening, even though I felt they tried to silence me, which is interesting.
It wasn't to silence you, but they wanted to meet. You came down on different sides, I think.
Well, the interesting thing was that the issue that night was white supremacy, and one of the things that they were doing was saying it's not that important. And it's interesting that shortly after that, we had the tragedy in Oklahoma, and then after that, there was the O.J. Simpson case coming to this forefront of racial tension, drawing out the tension that's been in our culture for such a long time.
And what do you say about white supremacy today?
Part of what I say is that white supremacy, first of all, isn't a white thing. It's part of this culture. It's part of how all of us have been taught to think about difference. Who's better, who's inferior, who's superior. I prefer white supremacy to racism precisely because it says that we're all being socialized to think along certain dualistic lines, and that the notion of that which is light or white being better, that which is dark or black being worse, bad, inferior, is something that everyone in the culture is socialized to think.
I'm going to speak about some political events and some recent events first, and two things you know I want to talk about, three things actually. First is the Million Man March. What did you think?
Well, the Million Man March was something that I deeply and profoundly opposed. I opposed it because I'm not one of those people who thinks you can separate messages from the messengers. I think that while the idea of black male solidarity and unity is a fine idea, just as who could not be moved by the images of all of those men, but underlying those images is a political ideology, is a way of thinking about family. I mean, just the other night I was giving a lecture at Dartmouth, and some young black men were saying, but how can it be wrong for black men to oppose welfare? And I said, well, it's one thing to say that black men should assume responsibility for families, and another thing to look realistically at our job and employment situation and to say what would actually happen to many single-parent households that women head if, in fact, there was not aid to assist women in a process of change and transition, many of whom are hoping for jobs that don't exist.
What ideology, back to what you were saying in terms of message and the messenger, what ideology do you believe was being promulgated? Was it the Nation of Islam?
No,
or was it some other ideology?
I would say that first and foremost it was patriarchy. I mean, when someone tells me in their mission statement that no nation sends its women to war while the men sit in the kitchen, and, you know, the situation of race in America right now is like war, you know, and the men are going to Washington, that to me is a real gendered dialogue about conventional masculinity, which denies a history of race relations where the engagement of black women in resistance struggle has been so meaningful and so crucial.
Would it have been less effective, as effective, or much more effective if women had been part of it?
Let me go on record as saying, Charlie, I have no trouble if men want to march by themselves.
Yeah.
I feel like men could march for days by themselves, and I'd sit at home and cook and clean if they were marching for principles and values and politics that would actually aid black self-determination. I happen to think that patriarchy has been deadly for the planet and for black men.
Okay, perhaps it has, but who says that they were marking for patriarchy? I mean, that's what I'm
Well,
sure
I mean,
I'm not sure that was the. If you talk to all those people that were there, which I didn't, but I've talked to people who did talk to them and wandered through the crowd without television cameras and had lots of conversations, and it didn't seem to be a patriarchy. It seemed to be about responsibility, and it seemed to be about some sense of self-esteem, and it seemed to be about fathers and sons and fathers and daughters.
But that sense of responsibility was connected to particular notions about the family, not about self-responsibility first, but it was the idea that, in fact, the old idea that men acquire self-esteem by the degree to which they can be providers and protectors. That is what patriarchy says to us. And what we know is that a lot of men provide, a lot of men protect, and they still have difficulties with self-esteem.
Have black women, in your judgment, endorsed feminism and responded to it?
Well, in Killing Rage, I try to talk about the fact that that black women have questioned feminism because of our recognition that race is always a factor. So there's been a calling attention to racism within the women's movement, particularly the racism of privileged class women who were saying, you know, we're victimized because of certain issues that black women did not see as an occasion for victimization.
Did it put black women against white women then?
Yes, I think the core reformist-based feminist movement very much pitted black women against white women by the fact that the discourses of women of color and black women were left out. For example, early on, a major thesis of feminism was women need to get out into the workforce. Right. Well, masses of black women were already into the workforce and weren't liberated.
Masses of poor women were already out of the workforce.
And that kind of work, who is it liberating for? So there was a real distinction between those women Betty Friedan was describing as sitting at home, many of whom were well educated, had been educated in the Ivy League or the Seven Sisters, you know, and weren't doing anything, and those masses of women who were in factories, who were, you know, cleaning people's homes, who did not see work as central to liberation, and who were in fact fantasizing about the days of their lives when they wouldn't have to work. So there's a chapter in Killing Rage about black and white female relations where I say, until our relationships improve, until black women and white women understand each other better, there will not be an end to racism in this society.
O.J. Simpson. What do you think? I mean, about the, not so much, obviously I'm fascinated by whether people thought he did it or not, but beyond that, are you surprised by the reaction to it? And
I was deeply surprised and troubled by the reaction to it, because I feel like I was one of the people who religiously tried not to watch the case, precisely because I felt, in respect to the fact that this was a case rooted in domestic violence. Here again, I don't think that people can pretend that in fact somehow the domestic violence doesn't matter. This tragedy would not have happened if male violence against women was not so acceptable in our culture. Because there is a line leading up to the tragedy. Whether we know who murdered this woman or not, we do know that a whole life that was structured around acceptance of violence was a part of how this couple related to one another. And that, to me, made me feel like once this becomes entertainment, once the camera is focused on O.J. Simpson, people will forget that at the heart of this is both male violence and male violence against women, because we've not heard anybody speculate that a group of women were outside that house chopping up anybody. So clearly, we cannot get away from the dilemma of male violence in our culture and male violence against women. And I try to hold to that as a way of not deflecting attention away from the fact that this was not an issue of race. I mean, that the case itself was not an issue of race. How we interpret it, how we witnessed it as a culture, it was racialized, but the heart of it still, for me, remains male violence against women.
But what about those, including Johnny Cochran, I guess, who would say, no, it was about race, because it was about race, and it's because of the attitude of the LAPD?
Well, I think, one, even before we knew anything about the attitude of the LAPD, we know that whenever sexuality is involved and gender in our culture, people often prefer to talk about race. Race is easier for people it's easier to racialize something, because if we make it a case of gender, we have to see a man like O.J. Simpson as very empowered by class and by patriarchy. If we make it a case of race, we can see him as always and only a victim. And so, of course, it was very important for men in general, and Cochran in particular, himself, you know, according to his ex-wife, someone who is no stranger to domestic violence, to act as though the only issue here is one of racial injustice.
Bell Hook's Killing Rage, Ending Racism. This is a collection of essays about a whole range of subject matter having to do with men and women and gender and violence and rage and a lot of other things. My friend Cornel West says, unlike most black intellectuals, she writes with a sense of urgency about the existential and psychocultural dimensions of African American life, especially those spiritual and intimate issues of love, hurt, pain, envy, and desire, usually probed by artists. Her books help us not only to decolonize our minds, soul, and bodies, on a deeper level, they touch our lives. It is difficult to read a bell hook's essay or text without enacting some form of self-examination or self-inventory, which is exactly what she would like for you to do. Thank you. Pleasure. We thank you for joining us. See you next time.